Okay, whether it's an AP exam in May or watching Jeopardy or just kind of being an educated human being, Jean Piaget is a name that you will want to know. And Jean Piaget, remember Mr. Woodard talked about continuity versus discontinuity? So Piaget's stages are kind of this discontinuity, these stair steps that we go up as far as our development is concerned. So one of the first things that you need to see is that there are 4 main stages, and you'll notice that there's the sensory motor stage, and then there's all those operational stages. So if you think about it, and I'll explain to this in more detail as we go along, but if you think about it, with sensory motor stage, what you're doing as an infant is your cognition is based on the senses that you have and the motion that you can do. So things that you can touch and smell, that's how you're cognitively developing. Operational, if you think of that word equating to abstract thinking, that's a good way to remember the other 3 stages, because there's pre-operational, which will be kind of before we can really abstractly think. Concrete operational stage is a stage where we can start to think abstractly, but we still need the concrete in front of us to help us. And I'll explain when we get there. And then formal operational is we can just full on think in very abstract terms. So let's take a look at each of these stages. So the first one is sensory motor, and this takes place from birth to about the age 2. Now again, these are fairly rough as far as the ages are concerned. They're going to differ depending on the child, but they're pretty close to a normal development. Okay, so some kids will get through this stage a little bit earlier, some a little bit later. So sensory motor stage is going to be birth to the acquisition of language. And if you think about it, if you remember Worf's hypothesis that we think in terms of language, well, if we don't have language to think in, how are we going to think? Well, with our senses, how we sense the world. So the child is going to rely heavily on that sensory and motor responses to stimuli. They're starting to develop symbolic thinking at this stage, but they are still far away from what we would consider that abstract thinking. So they're starting to figure some things out symbolically. And one of my favorite parts of this stage is object permanence. Object permanence is the reason why the game Peekaboo works. It's because for an infant, when they can't see your face anymore, they think you're gone. So that the object of your face is not permanently there. Once they can't see it, they think it's gone. So part of this stage is overcoming that object permanence. And you'll see this on a video. You can hide toys under towels and the child will just think it's gone because they can't see it anymore. Okay. All right. The pre-operational stage. Oops, lost mine. Here we go. Pre-operational stage is roughly from age 2 to 6. Symbolic thinking is starting to rev up a little bit. Language use is starting to rev up a little bit. That is why the symbolic thinking can rev up. And there are 4 terms under the pre-operational stage that you'll want to know. Now, first of all, remember, operational abstract thinking. So this is before we can really think abstractly. I'm going to give you some highlights just to explain these terms, but you'll see them in videos in class. So with egocentrism, we'll see a young child on one side of a little model mountain, and it's got trees and animals and all this stuff. And then the experimenter will sit on the other side, and she'll say, okay, well, what do you see? And he points everything out. Then they switch sides. And, well, what do you see? And he points all the stuff out. But then she asks the kicker. She says, what do I see? And he says everything that he's looking at. That's egocentrism, the inability to be able to understand that there's something that the other person is seeing that you're not. Okay? Animistic thinking is what I call Pixar thinking, Disney thinking. Anytime that you have a toy and you think it comes to life at night, that kind of a thing, this is very healthy. Imagination is very healthy. We're building those synapses that Mr. Woodard was talking about in the last video. Okay, so animistic thinking is very normal, natural stuff, giving inanimate objects lifelike qualities. Centration is a fun one. This is when you can only focus on one part of a situation at a time. So one of the videos that we'll show you, we'll have a child, it's kind of a famous one, is you'll have 2 rows of quarters. And the child can even count the quarters in each of the rows. And then you take one of the rows and spread them out. So same amount of quarters that they just counted, but you spread them out. And you ask, well, which line has more quarters? And they'll say that line that's spread out. Because they can only focus on the fact that that line is longer than the other line, even though they know or they counted the same amount of quarters in each line. So that's centration. And then the last one is irreversibility. Another famous one is you just take 2 cups of water. You have the same amount of water in each cup. You ask the child, well, which one has more water? They'll say, well, they have the same amount of water. Great job. Now you bring a tall cup in, pour one of those cups in the tall cup. Which one has more water, or do they have the same? They'll say that the taller cup has more water because it looks like it. That's that irreversibility. I can't go back, even though it was a few seconds ago, I can't go back and remember that both cups had the same amount of water in it. So part of the pre-operational stage is working through and overcoming these cognitive limitations. They're all very natural, but we want to overcome them. And we will overcome them as we get into the concrete operational stage. So now, this is what I meant. We're starting to get that abstract thinking, but it's hard to do when we still don't see it. It's not in front of us. When we really have to imagine something really odd or strange, that's still difficult, but we're getting that abstract thinking. So this is roughly 6 to 11. We're getting less of that animistic or magical thinking, but you're still concrete enough where you play the game 20 questions, and your first question might be, is it a bird? Well, that's a bad question to open with because you're not giving yourself any opportunity to get more information. You're just going to get a yes or no answer, and you'll know it's not a bird or not. But you can ask other questions that will give you more information with a simple yes or no. I'll show that to you on the next slide. Now, you're starting to overcome some of those things that we saw in the pre-operational stage. So now you can hypothesize before performing. So now you can start to realize, wait a minute, those 2 glasses just had the same amount of water, and you start to overcome that idea of irreversibility. Conservation is what I call the umbrella term for especially terms like irreversibility and centration. When you've got these 2 here, centration and irreversibility, those fall under the category of conservation. Conservation is simply the ability to understand that if 2 things have the same amount of mass to them, for instance, and I change the shape of one of them, it still has the same amount of mass as the other. So during the concrete operational stage, you're starting to develop this notion. So one of the things that you'll see is the little guy there in the lower right-hand corner. He'll see 2 balls of Play-Doh. They both have the same, he'll say, and then you switch one of them. Well, that one has less than the ball of Play-Doh. Well, in the concrete operational stage, you should start to now understand that I smash it, but it's still the same. And you're starting to get mental operations at a higher level now. You're starting to be able to, again, hypothesize. You're starting to think abstractly. You still might need to be able to see things in front of you. You're starting, though, to get that abstract thinking. And you're also developing a really important one called theory of mind. And theory of mind is, I have my thoughts, and you start to understand that the person over there has their thoughts as well. You start to understand that people are thinking different things. We have a good video that will hopefully show you in class on that. And then finally, the formal operational, now I can think very abstractly. I can think in terms, I don't have to have things present for me to think about these things. I can hear a story about something that sounds really crazy, but I can still imagine it and answer questions based on that story. You'll see a video on that. And it has to do with the abstract thought of a feather breaking a glass. A child might hear a story about a feather breaking a glass, but then be asked, can a feather break a glass? And they'll say, no, a feather can't break a glass. Somebody older might say, well, according to the story, the feather broke the glass. So they can think in terms abstract, even though something like a feather breaking glass can't happen. They can think in terms of, oh, yeah, the feather can break a glass according to that story. Again, you'll see that in a video. And here's your 20 questions again. You might open, instead of, is it a bird, you'll open with, does it fly? Well, yes or no. Now I've got more information now. If it's a no, then I can start really limiting what I might be looking for in that game of 20 questions. Why? Because I've got the abstract thinking going. Okay, that's it for Piaget. That's the basics of Piaget. Mr. Woodard, I believe you get to go to Vygotsky's zone of proximal development.